Montana Territory, early spring of 1873. Just outside the town of Stillwater, Eliakim Vaughn was riding back from a cattle trade when he found her. The churchyard lay quiet under a thin mist, the stones dark with last night's rain. Most Sundays, folks were already inside by now, hymns floating out the stained glass windows, but this morning was different. He spotted movement by the old maple near the back fence, something small and hunched. At first he thought it might be a mourner left behind. Then he heard the crying. Not just one voice too. One high and thin, the other muffled and shaking. He dismounted, boots soft in the damp grass, and came around the side of the tree. She was sitting in the mud, skirts soaked through, bonnet slipped from her head and lying beside her like she had not noticed it fall. Her arms were curled around a bundled baby, no more than a few weeks old by the look of it, wrapped in a worn blue shawl. The woman looked up, startled, eyes red and wild like she had not slept in days. Her lips parted but no sound came out. Eli crouched slowly, palms up. "I ain't gonna hurt you." She pressed the baby tighter to her chest, like she thought he'd come to take it. "I ain't gonna take her neither," he added, nodding to the bundle. You looked like you could use help." The baby let out a sharp cry, face scrunched, fists flailing. Eli reached into his coat and pulled out a clean handkerchief, offering it. "I got a canteen in my saddlebag," he said, "and some bread left over. You hungry?" The woman hesitated, then gave a small nod. Her voice came out hoarse. "Please." He fetched the items and returned, sitting on the grass beside them, not too close. It was cold for April, and she had nothing but a thin dress and shawl. He pulled his coat off and handed it to her. She looked at him, uncertain. "You'll catch fever like this," he said. "Wear it for now." After a pause, she slipped it on, the sleeves falling past her wrists. "I'm Eliakim Vaughn," he said gently. "Eli, if you like." She stared down at the baby, who was quiet now, soothed by the warmth of his coat. Her voice cracked when she spoke. "Brietta Ames." He nodded. "That your daughter?" She glanced up, then shook her head. "My sister's. She died giving birth. I was supposed to meet someone here, a cousin in Billings. He never came." Eli felt something twist in his chest. "How long you been out here?" "3 nights. Damn." He looked at the baby. "What's her name?" "Mathilda." Eli's eyes softened. "Pretty name." Brietta wiped at her face, ashamed. "I did not know where else to go." "You came to a church," Eli said. "That counts for something." She nodded, blinking fast, and leaned her cheek to the baby's soft head. "I did not mean to cry. I was so tired." Eli stood and held out a hand. "You do not have to stay here another night. I got room at my place. Warm bed, stew on the stove, and a roof that does not leak." She stared at the hand like it might vanish. "I ain't a preacher, but I show up Sundays," he added with a faint smile. "You'll be safe with me." Brietta hesitated, then slowly took his hand. He helped her to her feet, keeping the baby cradled close. Once she was steady, he led her to his horse and helped her up, then handed her Mathilda. He swung up behind and guided them toward the trail, his coat still wrapped around her shoulders. They rode in silence most of the way. The sun broke through once as they crossed the ridge, hitting the valley below with gold light. His ranch sat in the hollow, smoke rising from the chimney, fences neat and strong. When they reached the porch, he dismounted first and lifted her down easy, careful of the baby. "Come on in," he said. "You'll be warmer inside." The house smelled of coffee and wood smoke. There were 2 rooms, a main space with a stove, table, and cot, and a smaller one off to the side, door open and clean sheets laid out. "I never used the back room much," he said, setting down her bundle. "But it's yours now." Brietta stepped in slowly, eyes wide at the quiet comfort of it all. She looked back at him, her voice soft. "Why are you doing this?" Eli looked straight at her. "Because I know what it is to lose someone." She watched him for a beat, then nodded. "Thank you." He cleared his throat, suddenly shy. "I'll give you some time to rest. There's stew on the stove. I'll keep the fire going." That night, she fell asleep before the sun set, Mathilda curled in her arms. Eli sat on the porch, hat in his hands, watching the sky turn violet. The next morning, he hitched the wagon and took all three of them to town. Folks stared, but he did not pay them any mind. They needed more baby supplies and food. At the church, he stood beside her as Reverend Callahan raised an eyebrow. "This is Brietta Ames," Eli said plainly. "She and her niece will be staying with me." The Reverend gave a careful look, then nodded. "You bringing them next Sunday?" "I reckon I will," Eli said. "And every one after." That became the start of it. Every Sunday after that, he hitched the wagon, and they all rode into town together. Brietta with Mathilda bundled in her lap, Eli beside them. No one asked questions after a while. They just took the pew second from the back and kept quiet during the hymns. Brietta learned to bake in his kitchen, and Eli built a cradle from pine for Mathilda. He never said much, but his hands were always fixing something for them, mending her boot sole, patching a wall, carving toys. She watched him one afternoon from the porch as he sanded a little horse for the baby. Her heart ached with how safe she felt now. "Eli," she said quietly. He looked up. "I never thought I would have a home again." He gave a small nod. "You do now." And she believed him. The thaw came late that year. Snow clung to the shaded slopes past mid-April, and the river behind the Vaughn ranch swelled with meltwater, muddy and quick with ice still drifting in the eddies. Brietta stood at the kitchen table, sleeves rolled, flour dusting her knuckles. Mathilda slept nearby in a padded drawer Eli had carved into the corner bench. She was growing fast, always reaching now, her fingers curling around anything soft or warm. Eli came in from the barn, brushing straw from his shoulders. He paused in the doorway, watching the light shift across the floorboards. She didn't notice him at first, too focused on kneading the dough, her shoulders moving steady and firm. "You ever worked in a bakehouse?" he asked. Brietta looked up, surprised but not startled. "No, my mother taught me. Said every woman ought to know how to feed folks with not much." "She teach you anything else?" "Plenty. Sewing, herb poultices, how to find wild onions." She was Choctaw. Grew up in the nation before Fort Towson. Eli nodded once, thoughtful. "My stepmother was Kickapoo. Learned to tan hides from her. She could dry meat so clean it'd last a year." Brietta didn't answer, but there was a small lift to her mouth. She shaped the dough into rounds and placed them in the pan, hands sure and quiet. He stepped in, wiping his palms on a cloth. "Got a new lamb this morning. Breech birth. Took me near an hour to turn her." "Did she make it?" "Barely." He leaned against the doorframe, glancing toward the stove. "You ever delivered an animal?" "A goat once. Back home in Arkansas. Belonged to a neighbor woman who couldn't do it herself." "Then I might call on you next time." Brietta tilted her head. "You trust me with your stock?" "I trust you with more than that." She looked at him then, eyes dark and steady. The silence between them was full, but not heavy. Later that week, she found Eli in the paddock, watching the yearlings. He didn't hear her come up until she was nearly beside him. "I'd like to earn my keep," she said. "You already do. I mean with work, paid work. I was thinking maybe Miss Carraway at the schoolhouse could use help. I can read and write. I taught Sunday lessons in Little Rock before we left." Eli kept his gaze on the horses. "You planning on leaving?" No, he nodded slowly. Then I'll take you into town tomorrow. They rode in early, the road still damp from last night's rain. Brietta wore her hair pinned close in the way she always did when she meant to be taken serious. Mathilda stayed behind with Mrs. Baines, the widow who lived past the creek and took in mending for coin. She was the only person Brietta had agreed to leave the child with, and Eli had made certain she'd be close enough for them to ride back in under an hour, if needed. Miss Carroway was a stern woman with spectacles and no patience for idle talk, but after a brief test of Brietta's penmanship and a few exchanged glances, she agreed to let her assist with the younger pupils. When they came out of the schoolhouse, Brietta adjusted her gloves and looked up at Eli. I start Monday. He offered a nod. You want to stop by the mercantile on the way back? I'd like that. Inside, the store was quiet. A few men lingered near the counter, arguing over saddle oil. Brietta drifted toward the bolts of calico, fingers trailing over the prints. Eli stood back, watching her with the same still attention he gave to his cattle when one limped seeing without pressing. She lifted a small pair of shoes from the shelf, soft leather with brass buttons. She'll outgrow these in a month. Then we'll get another. Brietta hesitated. You don't have to buy them. I know. She turned to him fully. Eli, you've given us more than I ever thought to ask. I don't want to be a burden. You aren't. You never were. She held his gaze a long moment, then set the shoes gently in the basket. By late afternoon, they were headed back down the trail, wagon bed full of supplies. The wind had picked up, tossing dust across the ruts. Brietta tucked her coat tighter around her and turned toward him. Why don't you have a wife of your own? Eli kept his eyes forward. Didn't always have the means, then didn't see the point. Folks come and go out here. Some leave when the first frost hits. Some don't make it through the winter. And now. He glanced at her, the lines beside his eyes deepened by the light. Now I got a reason to stay put. Brietta didn't reply right away. She looked out over the fields, where the grass was starting to green in patches. You're a good man, Eli. He adjusted the reins, jaw set in that quiet way he had when words didn't come easy. I just try to do right by what's in front of me. That night, Mathilda woke just before dawn, fussing with hunger. Brietta rose, bleary-eyed, and padded into the front room. She found Eli already up, stirring the stove back to life. He reached for the kettle. I'll warm some water. She settled into the rocking chair, the baby nuzzled close. The room filled with the scent of cedar logs and the soft creak of old wood. Eli poured water into a tin cup and brought it to her. You don't have to always be up first, she murmured. I don't mind. She looked at him through the steam rising from the cup. You sleep at all? A bit. Enough. You take on too much. I've had worse burdens. Brietta traced the rim of the tin with her thumb. You think we'll be all right? Eli didn't answer right away. He pulled the blanket from the back of the chair and draped it around her shoulders, careful not to wake the baby. I think we already are. By early May, the cottonwoods had leafed out along the creek, shading the back pasture in a pale green hush. The mornings came earlier, and the air carried the scent of turned soil and something wild beginning to bloom. Brietta stood at the back fence with a tin pail in one hand, watching the light shift across the hills. Her apron was damp from rinsing the laundry, but she hadn't gone back inside yet. Eli joined her without speaking, a folded paper in his hand. His boots were caked in dry mud from the upper field, and his sleeves were rolled to the elbow, the skin beneath sun-browned and nicked from fence wire. I ran into Sheriff Tully in town, he said, holding the paper out. Brietta took it, scanning the neat, blocky writing. At the bottom, a name she hadn't heard in months. Clive Ames. Her fingers tightened on the edge. He's looking for me. That him. My father's brother. He's a tanner. Stayed behind when we left for Little Rock. She folded the paper slowly. He was never kind. You think he's after the baby? She nodded once. He hated my sister for running off. He always said no Ames woman should raise a child without a man under her roof. Eli leaned against the fence, arms crossed. He'll have to get through me first. He's stubborn, she said quietly. He doesn't care what a child needs, only what's proper in his eyes. Eli didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the grass, quiet as a whisper. Finally, he said, We'll go speak to the judge in Stillwater. Make it official. You've been raising her. That counts for something. Brietta looked up at him, her voice unsteady. You'd stand with me in court? I already do. She looked away, blinking fast. He'll call me unfit. Say I've no husband. No means. You've got a home. You've got work. You've got me. She turned toward the house, where Mathilda's soft coo carried through the open window. He'll twist it if he can. Then we won't give him anything to twist. The next day, they rode into Stillwater. The courthouse was plain red brick with a clapboard annex tacked on the back. Judge Harlan wore a vest that strained across his middle and kept a handkerchief tucked into his collar against the heat. He listened without interrupting while Brietta explained how she'd come to care for Mathilda, how no one else had stepped forward. Eli stood beside her, hat held against his chest. When she finished, the judge rubbed his jaw. You married? No, Brietta said. But you live together. Yes. And you've taken no payment for housing her? None. He looked between them, then leaned forward. Well, Miss Ames, Montana's got no law saying a woman can't raise her kin if she's willing and able. But you might make it easier on yourselves if you formalize your arrangement. Brietta's brow furrowed. You mean adoption? I mean marriage. She went still, barely breathing. Eli didn't move either. The judge folded his hands. Folks judge less when things are tidy. Outside, the breeze had picked up, scattering grit across the boardwalk. They stood at the hitch post, neither speaking for a long moment. I didn't expect that, she said finally. I reckon I did, Eli replied. Didn't mean I was ready to hear it. She glanced up at him. Would you? He met her eyes. If it means keeping her safe, yes. Her voice was quiet. And if there wasn't a court involved? He looked down, then back at her. Then I'd still say yes. Brietta turned her face into the wind and closed her eyes for a breath. I never thought I'd be asked like that. I never thought I'd be asking, he said. But I meant it. Then I will marry you, she said softly. They didn't speak of it again that day. They rode home just as they had come, the wagon creaking beneath them, the mountains sharp in the distance. That evening, she sat beside the cradle, watching Mathilda's chest rise and fall, and felt something in her settle for the first time in years. 3 days later, they stood before Reverend Callahan beneath the same roof where Eli had first seen her. Mrs. Baines held Mathilda in the second pew, and the only other witness was Thomas Wilkes, who ran the sawmill and owed Eli a favor. The ceremony was simple, the vows quiet. Brietta wore her mother's brooch pinned to her collar, and Eli had shaved just enough to make the occasion decent. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Eli took her hand weathered and small in his and held it like it was already a habit. That night, when she stepped into the room that had once been hers alone, she found Eli waiting by the foot of the bed, unsure and too still. I can sleep on the cot, he said. Brietta shook her head. You don't have to. He looked at her then not with hunger or hesitation, but with the kind of patience that had built every post and beam in the house. She crossed to him and laid her hand against his chest. I want to belong here, she whispered. You already do. They lay down side by side, fully clothed, her head tucked beneath his chin. No words passed between them, only the slow, steady rhythm of breath shared in the dark. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, but the walls held. By mid-June, the heat had settled in low and heavy, drawing flies to the porch and slowing the cattle in the fields. The wind came only in fits now, carrying dust and seed husks from the prairie grass. In the early evening, Eli came in with his collar damp and his back aching from stacking hay bales in the loft. He found Brietta at the table with a spool of thread between her fingers and a strip of muslin across her lap. Mathilda was asleep in the cradle beside her, one hand curled against her cheek. "You're sewing again," Eli said, setting his gloves on the shelf by the door. "I'm making her a summer shift. She'll be too warm in wool much longer. She'll be walking sooner than we think." Brietta looked up, tired but steady. She stood on her own this morning. Just a moment, but still. He crossed the room and looked down at the child. "Reckon she'll outrun me by next spring. You'll have to keep up." Brietta folded the cloth. "I'd like to take some of these into town next week. See if Mrs. Harrow at the feed store might sell a few." "She still owe you for that mending you did?" "She paid in flour." "I didn't mind." Eli sat across from her, the kettle still warm on the stove behind him. "You thinking of setting up something regular? I could take in small orders. There's enough women in Stillwater who don't have time to sew for their own. You'd need more cloth. I've been setting aside coin from the schoolhouse." She met his eyes. "I didn't marry you expecting you to carry everything. I didn't marry you expecting to stop you." She smiled at that, small and private. Later that week, they visited the neighboring Miller Ranch to help mend a stretch of broken fencing after a windstorm knocked down a cottonwood. Eli worked alongside Jack Miller and two of his sons, while Brietta stayed with Mrs. Miller in the cookhouse, shelling peas and keeping half an eye on Mathilda, who was propped on a folded quilt watching a chicken scratch in the dirt. Mrs. Miller wiped her hands and leaned on the table. "Folks in town say you're handling things well out there." Brietta didn't glance up. "We're managing." "He's not an easy man, Eli Vaughn. Never was one for company. He's kind when it matters." Mrs. Miller nodded. "That's what counts, I suppose." Brietta didn't answer. She tied off the bag of peas and stood. "We should head back before the light goes." That evening, after the wagon was tucked into the lean-to and Mathilda laid down with her quilt, Brietta stood barefoot in the yard, her hair unpinned and loose down her back. The heat hadn't broken even with nightfall, and the only sound was the chorus of frogs near the creek. Eli stepped outside, a tin mug in his hand. "You all right?" She didn't turn. "Sometimes I forget what it's like to be still." He came to stand beside her. "It's not always easy here, but it's slow when it needs to be." She looked at him, her voice quiet. "I used to think stillness meant I'd been left behind. You ain't behind anything now." She reached out and took his hand, rough and warm. "I never thought I'd belong to something this steady." "You do." Inside, the cradle creaked, and they both turned to look. Mathilda had rolled onto her side, still asleep. Brietta leaned her head against Eli's shoulder. "She'll grow up different than we did. She'll grow up loved." They stood like that until the moon cleared the ridge and lit the yard silver. The air was thick with clover and soil, and neither spoke again for a long while. They didn't need to. The first proper rain of summer came just after sundown, thick and steady, beating against the stovepipe and filling the ruts along the yard with warm puddles. Brietta stood just inside the barn door, lantern in hand, watching the drops streak down the wooden slats. She had come to check on the new calf, born only that morning with legs too long for its body and a soft, uncertain bleat. Eli emerged from the stall, brushing straw from his shirt. "She's fed twice now. That's good." Brietta nodded, eyes still on the rain. I never knew how comforting it could be just to watch something survive. He set the halter back on its peg and stepped beside her. You've got a steady hand with animals. I was always the one who'd sit quiet with them, even when I was small. My sister used to say I could talk a rabbit back from the edge of dying. Eli glanced at her, rain light flickering in his eyes. She'd be proud of what you've done for the baby. Brietta let the lantern hang low, its glow catching the hem of her dress. I think about her more now than I did after she passed. Not with grief, just a quiet remembering. She gave you Mathilda. She did. Brietta turned to him, voice low. And I gave her to you, too, in a way. Eli reached for the lantern and held it between them. You gave me both of you. They walked back to the house in silence, the rain softening to a hush behind them. Inside, the warmth from the fireplace had spread to every corner. Mathilda was asleep in the trundle bed near the hearth. Her little limbs sprawled like she'd fought hard against sleep and lost. Mrs. Baines had come that morning to help with the wash and agreed to stay through the rain, sleeping on the cot in the back room. Brietta had insisted she stay warm and dry, and the older woman never argued when it came to comfort. Eli poured them each a cup of chicory and leaned against the table. Brietta sat opposite him, her hands wrapped around the tin mug. There's something I never told you, she said. He waited. I was supposed to marry once, back in Arkansas. A farmhand's son. We were both young and scared of everything. He left before the wedding. Said the world was too wide to settle for one patch of dirt. Eli didn't ask his name. You were better off. I didn't think so at the time. I thought it meant I wasn't worth staying for. You were just waiting for someone who'd plant roots deep enough. She looked over the rim of her cup. Did you ever come close? Once. Before the war. She said she'd wait, but folks change when too much time passes. I came back and she was gone. Married a man in Kansas who made bricks. Brietta reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. We didn't miss anything worth keeping, did we? Not once you showed up in that churchyard. They sat that way until the fire sank low and the house fell quiet. Then they stood and moved through the room as if they'd done it 100 nights before. Eli banked the fire while Brietta gathered the baby's blanket from the rocker. When they reached their room, she paused at the threshold, the lamplight catching the curve of her cheek. I've spent my whole life trying not to need anyone, she said. But I need you. You have me, he said, for all my days. That night, wrapped in the warmth of worn quilts and steady breath, they didn't speak again. There was no need. The sound of the rain on the roof was enough. The weeks that followed passed in the quiet rhythm of shared life. Brietta's work with the schoolhouse continued 3 days a week, and her mending was soon sought after across town. She never took on more than she could handle, and Eli was careful to leave her time for the baby and the land. Mathilda began to stand on her own by high summer, wobbly but determined. She would crawl to Eli's boots each morning, tugging until he lifted her into his arms, where she'd grin like the world had been made just for her. One afternoon, Brietta brought home a wrapped parcel from Stillwater. Inside was the deed to the land, signed over in both their names. Eli read it once, then folded it and placed it in the strongbox with careful hands. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know, but I wanted to. That night, they sat under the stars on the porch, Mathilda sleeping inside, the night air thick with the scent of timothy grass and the last of the wild roses. I used to think home was something you found, Eli said. Turns out, it's something you build. Brietta leaned into him, her voice soft. And we built it true. Years passed, but the rhythm never broke. They added a lean-to for more stock, and Eli planted a windbreak of spruce along the north edge of the field. Brietta opened a small sewing room off the kitchen where women from town came to order dresses and share news. Mathilda grew tall and strong, her mother's quiet eyes and Eli's steady hands. She learned to ride before she was 7, and once came home with a stray calf she'd coaxed from the neighboring ranch. There were hard seasons of blight that killed half the potatoes one year, a fever that kept the baby in bed for a week, but nothing that ever carved a crack between them. They faced it all side by side, as they had from the start. And on quiet nights, when the house was still and the land lay hushed beneath the stars, Brietta would rest her hand against Eli's chest, feeling the slow, sure beat of a love that had never needed grand words or promises. It had only ever needed them, and it had been enough, always.